it has kinda become predictable at this point. Every time a new Pokemon game releases, discourse erupts about new Pokemon, the graphics, how still or not still the series is, and voice acting. This used to be a pretty non-issue for generations on end. I never heard people saying they wanted this, even though voice acting has been technically possible since the DS, the GBA even. Something about the step to home consoles, which the Switch is for 50% of course, has caused this talking point to absolutely explode. Part of that is surely due to simply the increased presentation, which means more is expected, and voice acting is a part of that, but a large part also definitely has to do with Game Freak's own decisions. After all, the conversation didn't start with the first Pokemon game on Switch, Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee. It was Sword and Shield that made people think, why is there no voice acting in Pokemon? And now we're 6 years later and still all we have is the grunts from the Legends series protagonists. What is stopping Pokemon from implementing this? And how big of a problem is it really? Let's talk about it. First off, to kinda continue the origin of this talking point, let's look back at Sword and Shield. I still firmly believe that if Game Freak had made a few different decisions during the development of the game, the cry for voice acting would not have been as big as it is now. After all, Let's Go already was a 3D game with TV level presentation, yet barely sparked any surprise at the lack of voice acting, and that has a lot to do with the actual scenes. Let's Go is a remake of a game that never had voice acting, and while the game does have some cutscenes the original title didn't, these moments are far and few between. But then look at what Sword and Shield did. It opens with a lengthy speech from Chairman Rose, a speech which could have really benefited from, speech. Later in the game, we watch Pierce perform a song, without vocals, and in general, these games are way more cutscene heavy than any prior Pokemon title. And obviously, in the modern era, we have become accustomed to cutscenes that have dialogue being voiced, even in games that traditionally didn't do that, like The Legend of Zelda for example. Had Game Freak not made the decision to include several scenes that really stood out due to their lack of voice acting, I'm not so sure if the outcry would have been as bad. A bit of evidence for this is Legends Arceus, which also had this higher level production but didn't really trigger the calls for voice acting as much as the other Switch Pokemon games have, partly because the story and the dialogue take a bit of a backseat here compared to the setting, themes and mechanics. Scarlet and Violet kickstarted the discourse all over again though, by introducing another musical character who doesn't speak, in rhyme, as well as adding another new problem, one that personally pushed me over the edge. Sure, the musical scenes were a little awkward, no denying that, but they didn't yet push me into the Pokemon needs voice acting camp, more so in the it would be nice. But what really made me realize that Pokemon needs it is the character writing that we first saw in Scarlet and Violet and was then seen again in its DLC as well as Legends Z-A. Game Freak has tried to build up a friend group for us as early as X and Y, but didn't really succeed. Sun and Moon reeled this back in a tad, and while I do think Lily, Gladion and Hau are well written characters, they don't really form a friend group like Nemona, Arven and Penny did, alongside the player of course. But it's exactly that kind of well written dialogue that makes these characters so likable and feel like genuine friends quipping at each other that also makes you wish these lines were voiced. Same thing with Carmine and Kieran, who are super fun and beloved characters, and now Team MZ from Legends Z-A. Their dialogue is written in such a fun way, it deserves to be voiced. Game Freak is doing their own writing a disservice by having us only read it and not give these characters as much as a voice, which really helps get a sense of who they are as people. And even if Game Freak pays zero attention to what other series are doing, they should know that. Case in point, Pokemon Masters. An actual official Pokemon game that gives every character included a voice. And it works really well. There are characters in this game who are as old as the series itself and have never really done much to stand out, but are now suddenly super interesting and memorable because of their voice. Koga is a good example, his Japanese accent really makes him stand out. Giovanni is another, voice acting really makes him all the more menacing. Anyone who has doubts Pokemon could successfully pull off voice acting owes it to themselves to check out the many voices of Pokemon Masters. Like, 95% of them are genuinely perfect. Maxie, Steven, Cynthia, Iono, Lance, Getsis, you name a character and chances are their voice is on point. Gala characters with British accents, Fantina and Viola sounding French, it adds a lot to how you perceive them. There are a small handful of exceptions, like the playable characters, who barely had dialogue to begin with, who end up feeling a little less familiar, but Pokémon Masters proves without a shadow of a doubt that you can certainly trust the franchise to find appropriate voice acting for these characters. So then, the question remains, why is Game Freak not doing it? Well, despite the many internal documents that have leaked from Game Freak over the past few years, nothing of an explanation has ever surfaced. No plans that discuss voice acting, no emails that state why it's not happening, nothing. All we can do is speculate. But I do have a few theories that might solve this mystery and provide a look at the future prospects. First of all, let's debunk a theory that I've seen floating around quite a bit recently, probably because it combines two elements fresh in the mind right now. And that is the idea that it's too expensive. You may have seen news reports or comments about people talking about the budgets for Pokémon games, which had leaked as part of the big leaks of 2024, but were only made public now. These budgets, they're not very high. Around $12 million for Scarlet and Violet and Legends Z-A was being reported, which may sound like much if you're not familiar with the gaming industry, but this is chump change for most AAA games. It's widely believed that something like Breath of the Wild costs around $100 million to make, if not more, so that Pokémon is around a tenth of that is shocking to say the least, especially when you consider the games sell fairly comparable. However, there is reason to doubt these numbers are entirely accurate. After all, the numbers get repeated everywhere, but we have no way to know whether the report it's from is actually final, what it all encompasses, and more. So while we do know it is an official Game Freak document, we don't know how true this number is exactly. But let's just say it is true. Let's say Game Freak has had around $12 million to work with these past two Pokémon games. That would still be more than enough to pay for voice actors. Indies with much smaller budgets can easily afford voice acting. It's not that big an expense that it would suddenly add a huge list of extra costs to the budget. Not to mention that Game Freak would also not have to do some crazy stunts to get voice acting done. Even if Pokémon Masters developer DNA isn't willing to help, there's always Nintendo with tons of contacts with studios, voice directors and resources to help manage unions and all that. So no, I don't believe for 1 second that budget constraints are the reason Pokémon games don't have voice acting. But money isn't the only resource. Another very important one is time. A lot has been said in the last few years about Game Freak's development cycle, and many people have pointed at it as the #1 reason why, in their opinion, Pokémon games are not as good as they could be. Part of that is a bit of misinformation. The idea that, because Gen 10 might come out next year, it has only been worked on for 1 year is completely incorrect. Game Freak starts work on a new Pokémon generation before the last one even released, and as such, Gen 10 has been in development since 2022. It's 4 years now. That may sound pretty long, but in the modern gaming landscape, it's really not. Just to compare it to another JRPG with similar enough mechanics, Persona 3 Reload was in development for about equally as long, and that is a remake, not an open world game with a wholly new story, characters, creatures, you name it. So my point is that 4 years is not actually all that long. It's long enough to deliver a working, good game, don't get me wrong, but when it comes to things like voice acting, it can be a problem. Especially if the dialogue isn't finalized until later down the line, which we don't know if that's the case, but if it is, that could prove difficult. You can't voice what isn't written after all. But what can especially cause problems is how tight the schedule is. Spending 4 years to make a game is not outrageously short or long. But it has a different connotation if you are hard-bound to spend 4 years on it. And that is definitely something that sets Pokémon apart from other games with similar development times. If a Zelda game takes a year longer to make than initially planned, it gets pushed back. If a GTA game isn't completely ready yet, it gets delayed. For Pokémon, that is impossible. A new generation of games is super important for the entire franchise, but it's only a cog in the money machine that is Pokémon. Sure, it is the most important cog, it is where everything you can then milk later comes from, but if the new games don't set the whole machine in motion, everything comes to a halt. And that can't happen. So that means that Pokémon cannot afford to make delays. Those 4 years are all you have. And we may forget about it sometimes, because Pokémon is a series that gets hated on a lot for its visual identity, But we can't forget that a lot of Pokemon's appeal comes from its artistic decisions. Its creature designs, its character designs, those are the most important part of the entire franchise. Those bring in the billions, and those are creative decisions, the kind of thing that is very difficult to rush. So I wouldn't be surprised if, internally, Pokemon gives that side of things a bit more freedom and a bit more leeway. After all, the design department is why people buy Pokemon games. It's not the Q&A division, or the graphics department, or the voice acting side of things. And so, those are put on a lesser level of importance. And that's how you get games that don't look as good as they could be, run in the way Scarlet and Violet ran at the start, and lack voice acting. Not because the money isn't there, but because it adds another thing that has to be done and accounted for to a schedule that can't afford not to be stuck to. And now you might think, okay, that sounds believable, but does it really take that long for professionals to voice their lines? Well, that's a good point. Voice acting generally doesn't take so long that you have to postpone the release for it. There's more than enough time, even in Pokemon's tight schedule, to make it work, if you only do English and Japanese. And I suspect there lies another part of the problem. I don't have to tell you that gaming is a worldwide phenomenon. I mean, I'm here, a European, talking to perhaps an American, or a South American, or an Asian, or whatever. We are all Pokemon fans. In fact, I'd wager Pokemon is one of the most widespread fan bases in the world. You show Pikachu to a random person on the street and they'll recognize it from New York to Rabat to Beijing to Buenos Aires. But that also immediately illustrates the problem. More so than any other game series I know, Pokemon has altered itself to local cultures and languages. If we now go around the world and show those people on the street pictures of Screamtail, well, not only will a lot of people answer Jigglypuff, we would also now suddenly get a whole bunch of different answers. Screamtail in New York, Sakabushipo in Tokyo, Colagrito in Madrid, Hercule in Paris, Brulschweif in Berlin, Haugiomai in Beijing, Codobrado in Rio de Janeiro, Hangtang Bek in Bangkok, Kodauland in Rome, the list goes on. Pokemon has an extremely high number of names, both for creatures and characters that have been localized all across the world. The Paradox Pokemon are a bit of an extreme when it comes to Pokemon names, I will admit that, but characters are much more commonly localized this heavily. You name a language and there's a fat chance Nemona has a unique name in it, even ones the games don't natively come out in, like Indonesian and Hindi. And that causes problems when it comes to voice acting. Sure, you could do what for example Persona does, to use that example again, allowing only Japanese and English voice acting, but subtitles in much more languages, but I can understand why Game Freak is hesitant to do that. We are still talking about a game aimed at children after all. It's not easy for a random German parent to have to explain why the voices say Nemona, but the subtitles say Nemila. Now, obviously, future games could fix this by making sure new characters have names that are the same worldwide, but that still leaves the problem of what to do when past characters return, or for Pokemon. You go to France and talk about Squirtle and they have no clue what you mean. That's Carapace, always has been. And that means that in order to not confuse the hell out of certain audiences, some quite widespread across the world like Spanish and French, you need to also have voice acting in their native languages, as is standard for games aimed at children. Donkey Kong Bonanza and Mario Wonder, for example, have native voice acting in every language they release in. Same with Sonic, it's similar to the philosophy of cartoons, you always try to localize the voices if that's feasible. But in Pokemon's case, you could make the argument it isn't feasible. Mario, Donkey Kong, Sonic, those aren't RPGs, with ton of dialogue, and they also aren't tied to that strict schedule we talked about earlier. And that is, I suspect, where the real problem lies. I think Game Freak feels that only having English and Japanese voice acting isn't acceptable. It has to be in all languages the game is available in, which was actually expanded by one for Legends Z-A, mind you, or not at all. And if you view it from that standpoint, yeah, their decision makes sense. Having to localize an RPG with tons of story and dialogue into, at this point, 10 languages is a level of dedication very few game companies have. I can't name you one. There are plenty of other RPG games with even more dialogue and less budget and sales that have voice acting, but none of them have more than a few languages available. I can't prove it, but I am very confident that is the reason why Pokemon games don't have voice acting, even if nearly all their contemporaries have, including other series that, let's say, don't always go for the maximum level of quality they could. Hell, there is even some evidence to suggest this is the case, as Game Freak developers have gone on record to say this is the reason why the Pokemon don't have their anime voices in-game. Pikachu is easy, its name is the same everywhere, and Eevee is similar enough that it works, but beyond that, Pokemon saying their names like in the anime simply becomes unfeasible. Or you get German Bisasam saying the word Bulbasaur. That's not ideal. So assuming this is true, how do we fix it? Is there any hope that this might change in the future? Well, yes and no. First, something has to change. If all factors remain as they are, we might not see voice acting for a long time, because it simply isn't feasible or worth it then. So let's think about it. How big is the chance Game Freak changes their mind on having every language voiced? That's very hard to say, obviously. We don't even know if they actually think that, even if I believe it is likely. I do think though that if the call for it becomes loud enough, a point may be reached where Game Freak bites the bullet and follows the examples of other RPGs, immersion breaking as it may be for some languages. Perhaps by using smart localizing, dialogue that avoids Pokemon names and other tricks, can a way be found in which it all just works. I don't know if the current outcry for voice acting is loud enough though, personally, but at the same time I can't help but feel voice acting is not too far away, even if that is based purely on my gut feeling. The other solution, of course, would be a loosening or removal of the strict schedule. After all, it's not like it's an impossible task to voice a game in 10 languages, it just takes effort and time. If that time is allowed into the schedule, then there is no reason why it can't happen, especially if the budget is also increased further, which those leaked documents do hint is the case. I always roll my eyes a little when people say there is no excuse for the biggest media franchise in the world, but in this case, it is true. There is no monetary reason why Pokemon can't have voice acting, and the widespread localization is a hindrance, but it doesn't have to be a problem either, nor does the schedule by itself really. It's only when you put all those problems together that it suddenly becomes more understandable why the games don't have voice acting, and it's suddenly not worth it. So until one of those things causing those problems is changed, I don't see how the games can feasibly implement voice acting, to be honest. And let me repeat, this is not me making excuses for Game Freak, and I very much want voice acting myself. But if you put yourself in the shoes of Game Freak, keeping their desires and restrictions in mind, I think the decision to not have voice acting is more understandable than it may seem from the outside looking in. But then again, Game Freak, you know this. You are in your shoes. Stop putting scenes of people singing into your games if you're not gonna voice them, God. Anyway, that's how I view this topic. But what do you think? Should Pokemon have voice acting? And if so, what do you think needs to be changed in order to make that happen? Or do you have another theory as to why it isn't here? Share it in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like and subscribe to the channel to stay updated on all my future Pokemon content coming up. For now, thanks for watching and enjoy the rest of your day.